Hi, everyone. Welcome to another webinar. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. We're just letting people log in and get set up. But while we do, I'll take a few moments, as always, to introduce myself, our association, as well as our event today. So my name is Tom Ulanowski. I am the chair of the C45 Quality Association. And, you know, I'm very happy to be with all of you today to put on another webinar, again, focused on cannabinoids and dried cannabis and testing. We've been talking about this issue because it is such an important issue to the industry for a number of months and years now. And so this is just an extension of that series, and we're very happy to present that to you. Before we begin, let's talk a little bit about our association. The C45 Quality Association is quite a unique industry association here in Canada when it comes to cannabis. There are others that are, I would consider, more kind of lobbyist or economic focused groups. We're an industry organization that's non-for-profit. We're membership backed, not corporate backed. And we represent around 100 members in Canada in various quality, regulatory, testing, and consulting roles. And we were started a few years ago by industry professionals with the one goal to kind of strive to be a unified voice for these people in this industry. And we do a number of things to advance our mission here. Number one, we put on events like this, these virtual events. We try to do them about monthly. We put on about a dozen or more in the last 12 months, and they can range from a variety of topics. Sometimes they're solo presentations like we have today with Ryan. Other times they're panels, or we have a few presenters. And so keep your eyes peeled for more events. I believe we're going to be announcing another one soon for kind of mid to late April. And you can go on our website and take a look at that. We also put on in-person events like our Quality Summit. We haven't for a few years, but I'm happy to say that that's happening again this year, and I'll talk a bit about that in a second. And we also engage regularly with our regulators, namely Health Canada, the provinces. Our goal is to distill the feedback from the industry, our membership, our board, about the most pressing issues of today as they relate to quality regulations, testing, and kind of provide that feedback to Health Canada in a very constructive manner. And we do that either in writing, like many others do when there's kind of an engagement opportunity. We also meet with them regularly in person or virtually, and we really appreciate that relationship. And we're very proud of the information that we can provide Health Canada from our members to be able to make some progress and some changes on, again, the most pressing issues like the one we're talking about today. If you want to learn more, go to our website, c45association.com. Please consider becoming a member. We do all of this for free. All of our board members are volunteers. We just collect membership fees to help us with our, legal and accounting and website and hosting kind of fees. Memberships start at $49 for students, $99 for non-voting, and it goes a long way to help us get us some resources to put these events for you. So please, if you've been to any of our events in person or virtually, and you want to help us out, nothing would help us more than becoming a non-voting member or student member at least, and help us get us some more resources. And we're always looking for volunteers and presenters. So if you want to put on an event like Ryan is today, just reach out. You can email me at tom@c45association.com or the team@c45association.com. Give us the pitch, and we'll see if we can put on an event. And so that goes for both organizations and individuals who just want to talk about a specific subject. Now, I did mention that the C45 Quality Summit is back. We are bringing it back after many years of hiatus due to COVID. It'll be Friday, June 7th, 2024 in Hamilton, Ontario. We're hoping to gather around 200 folks from government, both federal and provincial, the industry like labs and processors and growers, and even academia. And we were actually confirmed a few Health Canada representatives, but we'll be announcing those speakers and as well as our schedule in the coming weeks. We're just kind of firming a few things up. But it is a one-day fully catered event. We're going to have panels, presentations, workshops. We're going to pack this day with lots of great people and lots of great opportunities to network. and connect with peers, thought leaders, innovators in the industry, regulators, and really we're trying to make this as accessible as possible. Right now, you can get a ticket for $99 if you're a member. That will change come March 31st. They're going to start going up in price. And so we encourage all of you, if you're interested, to secure your ticket now. And if you become a member, you'll get a discount on that ticket as well. And we are looking for still some speakers, some ideas for panels, and obviously sponsors. Sponsorships are selling out fast. We only have a few spots left. So if you're someone who wants to, highlight their company or their brand in the context of this event, this is a great opportunity. Again, email the team at c45association.com and we'll sort you out there. Okay. And you can see information about the summit, and we'll be updating the website shortly, c45summit.com. Okay, so without further ado, just a bit of housekeeping. As always, this webinar is being recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel shortly, just like our past events. I encourage all of you to check that channel out. There's a lot of great content on there. After this talk, we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for a Q&A, so that'll be an opportunity for all of you to engage. So please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom client. Ask questions throughout. I believe others can see and upvote and comment. And so that when the presentation is done, we have a nice, basket of questions we can reach in and discuss. And if there's any technical issues, just use the chat box, shoot me a message, and we'll sort that out as soon as possible. And we just ask that everyone's respectful, constructive with our questions and comments, because that's the goal of this, just to have a constructive discourse about these topics. So without further ado, I'd like to kind of introduce Ryan here. Ryan Pusiak, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa. Ryan reached out to us a couple weeks ago, even a couple of months ago, I believe. Ryan's been someone who's obviously been actively watching our presentations. He himself studies hops at the University of Ottawa and is soon to be defending his PhD. But cannabis is, as we all know, a very close relative of hops, and some of his work for his academic research has been related to cannabis, I believe. So he reached out, wanted to continue this discussion about potency and THC, especially in dried cannabis. And so this is what we're going to have today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the virtual microphone over to Ryan here, and Ryan's going to do a presentation. Good luck, Ryan, and we'll see you on the other side with the Q&A.
Cool. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, so just to reiterate, I'm doing my PhD right now. I've already submitted, so it's kind of just waiting for that defense that'll come in about 8 weeks. Thank you, everybody, for joining me, for taking this hour out of your day to hopefully learn a little bit about what's been going on in terms of the recalls for cannabis. So I'm just going to share my presentation here. And I think we're ready to get started. Hopefully everybody can see this.
Looks good.
It looks good. Awesome. Thank you. So the title of my presentation, THC Tipping Point, a review of cannabis product recalls and cannabis equivalency and more. So let's see what I found out. Let's see if the industry says, yeah, that's basically what's been going on. So it'll be a good discussion. So some of the benefits from legalized cannabis, of course, government at the top. They get some tax revenue and lower costs in policing. The licensed producers have a high quality product with a wider clientele, so they can reach more people with their products relative to the illicit market. And then for the consumer, there's a wide variety of products, and there's growing social approval of the use of cannabis and the various forms of cannabis products. So some of the successes, there's quality assurance and quality control. So that separates the legal from the illicit market. And then there's also been a lot of tests that need to be done for legal products, such as potency, which is the percent THC by weight. And then there's also microbe testing, contaminant testing. That's for things like mycotoxins and pesticides and metalloids, as well as residual solvents. So if you're using butane to make your hash oil, you got to make sure that there's not a lot of butane left over, or else it's going to be recalled. So there are variability limits that are put in place. This is especially true for the 2.0 products. So those are things like the edibles, the topicals, and more. However, cannabis flower has not been included in this variability limit range. So, for example, if the edible, I'll just use edibles as an example, if it's less than 2 milligrams of THC, and let's say it's 1 milligram THC, then it can range between 0. If it's more than 10 milligrams THC, then it can range between 8.5 and 11.5 milligrams. It says that my internet is unstable. I'll give a second.
There was a bit of stutter there, but it's all cleared up, Ryan.
Okay, so pretty much the summary here is the variability limits that exist for edible products, as well as extracts and topicals. So moving forward, there's the cannabis use survey that's done every year, and the most recent survey comes from 2023, where approximately or exactly 60% of cannabis users prefer cannabis flower. So that means that this is a very popular type of cannabis product that's available on the market. A lot of people prefer it over the other types, or maybe they just haven't explored the other types. And then we have things like hashish topicals and concentrates closer to the bottom. Let's hope to see those topicals increase with the dried cannabis equivalent shift, as I'll touch on later. So the dried cannabis flower, there's a bit of label versus reality here, and this is what I'm going to kind of highlight in this presentation. Biological limits, some suggest that it's under 30% cannabinoids by dry weight. So anything over 30%, you kind of have to be a little bit suspicious. As of April 2023, which was, about a year ago, 36% of the products range between 30 and 42% THC. And here's an example from good old Reddit, where a person bought 3.5 grams for $48. It's around 35% THC. The picture looks really nice. That's cool, but that's what they got in reality. And if you're taking the dry weight, that also takes into account these stems and stuff like that. So it's very unlikely that it's 30% THC when you have all of these sticks that don't contain much, if any, THC. It's the flowers, it's the trichomes that contain the THC. So there's a bit of this THC inflation going on. I said, well, I should probably give an updated by the numbers. So here it is, inventory from February 9th. There are 800 dried cannabis products available on the market, and about half of them range between 30 and 40% THC. So that's a large number of products where it doesn't necessarily make biological sense. And then for those that are looking for low THC products or THC levels that it would have been kind of back in the day, if it's consumers that are revisiting cannabis, you're looking at about 4% or 3.5% of the total dried cannabis flower available on the market. That's less than 10% or less than 100 milligrams per gram. So it seems like there might be some type of pressure to sell the highest THC bud possible. There's the potential that it's the Pareto distribution. So that's 20% of the customers make up 80% of the sales. And if there's that drive from that vocal minority for higher THC, then that's what will appear on the labels, but it might not necessarily be what's there in real life. So preference for higher THC, coming from academia and stuff like that, it's about consumer education. There's more to cannabis than just THC. I see that time and time again on LinkedIn. People saying, hey, I have this really good bud, but it's not testing 30%. It's in that 20% range. There's the preference for high THC products, maybe suggest to the person other products such as infused pre-rolls or vape pens, like those are pretty heavy hitters, as well as hashish, Old Faithful. And there's products beyond dried flower. So if you're looking into any of the other classes of cannabis, those have strict variability limits in place that are laid out in the cannabis regs as well as the Cannabis Act. So those are things to be kind of taken into account. Whereas with dried flower, there is no variability limit. So really what's on the package might not be what you're getting. And I hope somebody completed that maze that's in the right corner. So the top 12 best-selling strains on the OCS has two strains that are over 30% THC. So that's these two right here, and two strains that are greater than 5% CBD. So, there's kind of this dichotomy at play. There's the high THC ones, and then there's this lower THC, higher CBD or balanced strains. And then the other 8 strains are somewhere in between. So that's kind of interesting. It means that some of the best-selling strains are high CBD strains, and some of them are high THC strains, yet we have over 50% of dried flower that's over 30% THC. I don't know, it kind of doesn't really check out. So, moving on, more about the variability. Where does this variability come into place? Here's an example that has about 50% variability. If it's 38%, you take the high number minus the small number divided by the small number, you get about 52% variability in that product if you're getting the high THC. But if you're taking the average, it's closer to 28% variability. And if you're confused by this, rightfully so, I'm a little bit confused by it too. So that's why there should be clear guidelines on the variability limits. The labeled amount of THC is based on the testing methodology as well. So are the testers taking into account the moisture content? Are they pouring liquid nitrogen on it to try to get out as much moisture as possible? Is it a generous sample? I recently had a comment about that. Where is it keef that they're adding to these specific samples and sending it to the testing lab to get higher levels of THC? Is the extraction protocol related to dry weight, or is it related to the weight of the extract? If you have an extract and you dry it down, what's kind of happening there? Analytical standards. So there's multiple standards that are available right now for chemical testing. Is it 90 or 99% THC? That can give you a little bit of a window of variability between labs. And then consistent experimenter biases, there are one or two experimenters that tend to always have higher levels of THC in their samples. That's a possibility too. And all of these come together as the methodology. What's the standard operating procedure for testing the cannabis sample, as well as the machines that are being used. Are they using gas chromatography or high performance liquid chromatography or ultra high performance? There's all sorts of different things that can happen, a lot of different variables that can be in place, so that can affect the final THC content. So causes for variability in the finished product. Here's an example from Knight et al. 2010 that tested 6 different plants that they grew. And each of these green bars represented a different sample for each of the plants. The plants are listed P1 through P6. And the highlight here is that there's high levels of variability between plants. Like if you compare P1 to P2, P1 doesn't get much more above 5%, whereas P2 goes as high as 30%. And then you have variability within the same plant. So if you look at P5, it's somewhere just below 15% in 2 of the samples, but over 25% in one of the samples. So it depends on where you're kind of sampling from and to get a representative sample. There are different testing methodologies that result in different percent THC. So again, from Jacobs and Zurab, 2018, they tested or they obtained the total THC dry weight test results from 6 different labs, and they found that one of the labs is consistently higher than the other ones, and some of the labs are pretty consistent. A and B are around the same. And you would expect them to all be around the same. You wouldn't expect there to be this huge difference among the labs unless there's a methodological difference that makes some of them higher than the rest. So that's something to just kind of think about. There's variability limits in other products. So alcohol in Ontario, I'm sorry that this is a really Ontario focused thing. I would love to do more research on the BC cannabis store as well as anything that's going on in the Maritimes or prairies. But alcohol in Ontario, there's strict variability limits of 1% for table wines and as low as 0.3% for spirits. So that means that the vodka that you're buying to make your cannabis tinctures with, will range between 39.7 and 40.3%. Smoked tobacco, nicotine, there's no variability limits because it's not listed on the package. They got rid of that years ago. And natural health products, at least for microorganisms and enzymes, it needs to have about or over 80% of its activity at the end of shelf life. So that would be things like probiotics or any of the digestive enzymes that people might take. So that's there are industry standards. So variability exists without limits. What could go wrong? So the example here with the peacock, it's like, if there's no real predators, these males can make really pretty tails. And they just keep getting prettier and prettier as the years go on through evolution. But then in terms of cannabis, these things going unchecked puts a huge cost on government that needs to notify the licensed producers, retailers, and the public. I'm sure that those recalls cost quite a bit of money. The consumers have the right to know the percent THC in their flower. It's just basic stuff. If you're selling a product, the consumer should expect to see what's on the label is in the product. This can help them better titrate their dose or know their limits between sessions. And the LPs have the SOPs to issue recalls, and I'm sure it's costly for them too. I'll revisit that again shortly. Moving on to where did these cannabis recalls come from? I still don't know the answer to this, but here's one example from BNN Bloomberg in March 8th, 2021, where one LP noticed that another LP had 18 batches labeled at 20% THC. This is highly unlikely, as we've seen from the Night et al. Paper, that cannabis fluctuates so much. So the LP alerted Health Canada saying, hey, there's something going on. Health Canada probed, but no recall was issued. So I don't know the story behind that. I'm sure there's something. I'm sure people have a story about that, but that's just kind of what happened here. Which product has the same number of recalls as cannabis? So this is kind of fun. We can think about this for a minute or two while I have a sip of coffee. So are cannabis recalls similar to romaine lettuce, the same number of recalls? Cantaloupe, that's been in the news. Spinach or beef? So this is kind of like, something to think about. And I think the lettuce was around 4 recalls. The cantaloupe was at 8. The spinach was at 16. And the cattle was at 82 number of recalls. And cannabis, meanwhile, has had 82 recalls since legalization, or like a bit with the medical side of things before 2018 and then after 2018. So the issues for cannabinoids on the label, there were 44 of those. So that's over half of all of the recalls for cannabis have been due to this cannabinoid labeling issue. Taking a deeper dive into the different product categories, dried cannabis has about 2/3 of the recalls for all cannabis products. And we can really just see that exponential equation here, where the most is at the dried cannabis, and there's very little for topicals. Good job, topical group. Again, very low for most of these 2.0 products, and that's because possibly that these 2.0 products have variability limits in place, so they know the rules that they have to play by. Whereas with dried cannabis, it's like you really don't know when, if and when to issue a recall and how much that would cost your company. So the majority of the recalls come from incorrect uh, cannabinoids on the label. I really thought that the microbes would have been higher, the chemical contaminants pretty low, other issues with labeling, and then extraneous material. All of these data are available online through the uh, Canadian recall list. I just kind of compiled them all into an Excel spreadsheet and then uh, kind of tabulated them to make these nice graphs. There's no horizontal lines. That's nice. It's just nice and clean. So looking at other product recalls, there's some that are over small differences in THC. So here I have the labeled THC and the actual THC. So some of them are less than 1% or around 1% difference. And then others are large differences. So here we're looking at 184 milligrams per gram. And then this one went off into outer space with 1700 milligrams per gram difference between the labeled and the actual. So I think what happened here is that it's the confusion between percentage versus milligrams per gram. So if you want to get from percent to milligrams per gram, you just move that decimal over, and then vice versa. If you have milligrams per gram and you want to go percent, you just move that decimal to the left. So that's kind of what happened here. To highlight kind of a bigger recall that happened in October 2019, there was one lot that had the label with the error claiming that it was 5% CBD, but the correct value was 0 CBD and 21% almost THC. So THC indicated on the label is lower than the actual THC. And surprisingly, Health Canada didn't receive any complaints. Because if you're a cannabis consumer and you want to smoke a CBD strain or you want to consume a CBD strain, you'll have a completely different effect than if you wanted to consume a THC strain. So that's kind of important. It's very important. So the costs associated with the recalls, the government loses some tax revenue because essentially those products would have been sold. The public notices as well as the paperwork. The licensed producers have the product loss. I don't know where it goes afterwards, probably gets disposed of. And then also the loss of customer loyalty. If you built up your brand solely on a given product and that has a recall, you might lose some customer loyalty. Alternatively, you might gain some customer loyalty because you're honest with your product. And then with the consumer, they might have loss of trust in the legal cannabis market and then go back to the illicit supply. So that's a lot to kind of take in. Potential solutions for all of this. There's a paper by Sarma et al. And they suggested setting variability limits at 20% THC. This reduces the unnecessary recall, so differences less than 5% absolute THC, and reduces waste because maybe some of those that would fall out of the specifications could be made into something else like extracts. Another solution would be to create cultivars with consistent levels of cannabinoids under specific growing conditions. And then to also have consistent analytical standards and maybe advertise the reference material that's available from the National Research Council. I know that they have some and it's standardized to a given percent THC. So if that was given to these different testing labs once or twice a year anonymously to say, well, how close can you get? That might help ensure some consistency between the labs and reduce the potential bias in sampling or in testing. I've also heard that Health Canada might have a methodology to run for THC on the HPLC. Perhaps something like that should be publicly available. But that's not up for me to decide. So some of the conclusions from the cannabis recalls: dried cannabis is the most popular, but also has the highest variability. And there's differences in the recall severity, some 1%, some 100, over 100%. Setting a variability limit of 20% could reduce the recalls. This has been suggested by Sarma et al., my paper in 2021, and then the high claims presentation that was given last week, or last month, that was really good. There are variability limits that are in place for 2.0 products, so the implementation to dried cannabis flower shouldn't really be an issue. And this enhances consumer trust, reduces waste, and saves on paperwork, because I'm sure there's a lot of paperwork that needs to be done all the time. So future work, if people want to try to collaborate or want to collaborate with me, I can explore this difference between the labeled and actual amount across recalls. The weight of all of these recalls, perhaps if these licensed producers are still in business after the recall, and for how long after were they in business. Explore the availability of high versus low THC flower across provinces. That's what I mentioned before. This was another thing that I kind of wanted to touch on, and C45 gave me the room to do this, so thank you for that. Is what's the deal with this dried cannabis equivalence? I almost feel like Jerry Seinfeld there. So there's a 30-gram possession limit for dried flower, just over 1 ounce. There's multiple classes of cannabis products, so there's a need to kind of standardize this across product types. This avoids exceeding the 30-gram limit. Sounds pretty good. Makes sense. How do you compare a dried cannabis flower to an edible? It's difficult. So you create a conversion factor for each of the product categories. So you just simply take the product weight, not accounting for THC, multiply it by the conversion factor, and then you get the dried cannabis equivalence, and it's on all of the 2.0 products. Here's a quick table highlighting here that the cannabis beverage has actually increased now up to 570 grams, is equal to 1 gram dried cannabis. Before, I think it was much lower. And then you have things like concentrates. So that would be anything like your infused pre-rolls, vape pens, anything like that. And that's at 0.25 grams. That's equal to 1 gram dried cannabis. And plant seeds, 1-to-1, which is kind of interesting because I'm sure you can grow more than 1 gram of cannabis from one plant seed. But I'm not a grower, so there you go. This is likely to reduce diversion to the illicit market, and it's easy for law enforcement to calculate. If they see someone with 20 cookies, they do the conversion factor. Okay, there it is. But there are some issues with it, as I'll highlight. So the dried flower equivalent, here's an example. If you buy 5 packages of 1.5 grams of these pre-rolls that are infused, you're going to reach your 30-gram limit. And that's because these pre-rolls have mostly dried cannabis flower, but they're infused with an extract. Therefore, they're classified as an extract. Alternatively, you could buy 28 grams or a lot more than the infused pre-rolls and still have 2 grams to spare. So these are just things to kind of take into consideration when purchasing products, is that there is this dried cannabis equivalence, and we're not really sure why it's still in place, or at least I'm thinking that. So the purchasing limits relate to the cannabinoid classification. I think there were a few questions about that, so let's touch on that here. The beverages, I have the potency, 10 mgs. The amount to reach the limit, I have specific examples for each of these. So you get 500 milligrams of THC to reach your 30-gram equivalent limit. And that comes out to about 60 cents per milligram THC. Moving down to, let's say, flower, it's 21% THC. It's a 1-to-1, so you can buy 30 grams. So that's 6,300 milligrams of THC to reach the limit. Okay, and let's say you found that one that's 39.5% THC, and it's actually 39.5 THC. You're almost at around 12,000 milligrams of THC to reach the limit. But the real heavy hitters here are the oral sprays, where to reach the limit, you can purchase 62 grams or 62,000 milligrams of THC, which is a doozy. That's double the amount of dried cannabis flower that you can purchase by weight, or 10 times as much THC as in the dried flower here. The transdermal patch, pretty expensive, but you can purchase 85 grams of pure THC. If you want to go that route, it'll cost you almost $60,000. So that's probably why nobody does it. So why is there this discrepancy between the stars? So the lozenges, good old lozenges, the THC to reach the limit varies based on this dried cannabis equivalent, which is the grams per unit. So if you have a lighter product or a product that has lower weight, you can have a higher amount that can be sold at one transaction. And then the same thing kind of with the flowers, that more THC can be sold, almost double the THC could be sold if it's a high THC flower versus a low THC flower. So it kind of gives you this sense that you're getting more bang for your buck, I guess, in this situation, although it is about double the price. So there's many things to take into account here. So the winners from the dried cannabis equivalent, the oral sprays, good on you. Large amount of THC, low cost per milligram THC. They're discreet and they're flavored. How lovely. Transdermal patch, it was shortly no longer available after I publicized it on LinkedIn, but maybe they'll come back. The lozenges, pharmacologically the same as edibles because you're taking it through the mouth and it's going into your tummy. People could alternatively buy oil and consume over 10 milligrams per serving. So there's many ways to get high THC edibles into your system. Flower, it's affordable and it's the most popular. So I figured it's a winner here. The losers from the dried cannabis equivalents, you're probably wondering what's going on here. The topical products, I feel bad for the topical manufacturers because the dry cannabis equivalent is based on the weight of the product and not the quantity of the cannabinoids. So pretty much if I took this joint that's on top of this Epsom salt and I just sprinkled the smallest amount, I would be 8 times over the legal possession limit, and I don't know what would happen to me. I would probably be heavily fined and maybe put in prison. So I'll try to avoid that. Instead, if you want to have the psychoactive effects of cannabis, you're much better off having an Epsom salt bath and then smoking the joint in your bathroom with your fan on, of course. And then instead of bathing with these cannabinoids, although the topical application of these cannabinoids have a different effect and can have anti-inflammatory or medicinal properties. So the edibles, I feel like, are also a loser from this dry cannabis equivalent. It's still 10 milligrams THC per limit. And you can contrast that with the oils and extracts that are up to 1,000 mgs, or the lozenges that are at 100 mgs per package. And yeah, the CBD products, I also feel bad for you guys with the dried cannabis equivalent, because if you wanted to buy 4 packages of these lovely edibles from Kinlock Wellness, you would not be able to. You would not be able to because you would reach the limit. I don't know if I glitched again. Hopefully not.
All good.
It's all good. Okay, good. So the weight here is everything when it comes to these legal edibles. This is another post from my LinkedIn, where basically the lower the weight, the more product can be sold at a given time. So for here, for example, the cookie dried equivalent is 1.33 grams for 10 milligrams THC. And then the gummy here is 0.15 grams per 10 milligrams THC or per package. So pretty much you can buy way more of these gummies than you can of these cookies. So if you're trying to sell products, try to have a lower weight product so you can sell more. Or we can just try to work through this dry cannabis equivalence and make it based on the THC of the product. Let's give a quick touch on the illicit edibles. So this top one here is from the Ontario Cannabis Store. It's 520 or it's $5.20 per pack, so it's 52 cents per mig THC. The illegal edible here, it comes out to about 2 cents per milligram THC. So that's a huge difference. That's 25 times less for the illicit edible than the legal edible. So this is why I assume that the illicit edibles are still a thing, because you can buy as much as you want because there is no purchasing limit. That would be the equivalent of buying an iPhone Pro Max, for instead of it being $2,000, it would be about $80. So that's food for thought, I guess, pun intended, because they're edibles. So that's interesting that this is the case. Like, you could buy an iPhone for $80 instead of $2,000. It's huge. It's a huge cost savings. But then does it come at a risk to your health? It's kind of unknown. So the recommendations that I kind of have here is to increase it to 100 megs per package for legal edibles and to distribute it first medically and then recreationally. So the conclusion from the dried cannabis flower, right on time, is it's implemented to standardize cannabis across products, enforce limits across products, reduce diversion, perhaps help law enforcement. Although it's not based on THC, so you have products that are like very lucrative, like the oral sprays, and then the transdermal patches as well. And then you have the losers that are the topicals because it's based on weight, as well as CBD products that have no psychoeuphoric effects or they don't get you high. So the recommendation, you could set an arbitrary limit of THC to 10,000 mgs. That's nice and arbitrary, 10,000 mgs THC, or just kind of get rid of this dried cannabis equivalence altogether. We tried it for 5, 6 years now, and I think it's time to kind of lay it to rest. This would enhance CBD product development and sales, as well as kind of enhance these low THC products, because there is this biphasic effect where at a low dose, you might still have a little psychoactive, little effect. And then you can produce a product that's low in THC. Future work, of course, if people want to collaborate here, that would be cool. Add more evidence that some products are incentivized by this dry cannabis equivalency, others are disincentivized. Come to a solution. I would be totally down for chatting with licensed producers, members of parliament, members of provincial parliament, because I'm sure they have something to do with it, as well as Health Canada or any other organization that kind of wants to highlight this issue and maybe come to a solution. So again, my acknowledgement, C45 Association, that was great. Chelsea Cox, for her constant support in this cannabis discussion. Dr. Dre for your dope beats, still hits. Family and friends, especially my wife Amanda and my son at the Harris Lab. And remember, I study hops, so I could give a whole presentation on product development of hops, but for today, I focused on the other half of the Cannabinaceae family, which is cannabis, as well as the Ontario Cannabis subreddit. They're great. And if anybody wants to contact me, my email is here. And I'm sure Tom can also include my email if he hasn't in the invite. So thank you very much for your time. And I'm here to field some questions.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. That was great. Really appreciate the opportunity to hear your presentation here. So yes, we have, I'd say 10, 15 minutes left for questions. We have a few questions and comments in the Q&A box. I will remind everyone, please type it in if you want to ask a question. We have plenty of time here, or you can raise your virtual hand on Zoom if you want. We can turn your mic on and we can have a little bit of discussion if you wanted to kind of have a little bit more interactive dialogue. I will begin. I have always some comments and some interesting points and anecdotes to raise, and then we can delve into this Q&A. So, I first and foremost, I think if you're in the industry long enough, you're not really surprised that recalls, the vast majority of recalls since legalization, or even before, were related to dried cannabis. The vast majority of those are related to labeling. I think, when you kind of compare that to other non-cannabis product, it's clear that we as a new industry had a lot of I would say learning, and that's a little bit of the reason for why we have such a high number of recalls compared to lettuce or fruits and veggies. But and I will also say that it's actually kind of great news to see that clerical errors essentially are the reason for recalls versus more high risk things like chemical or microbial contamination. I think that's a positive way to look at it. Also, though, on the other hand, recalls, as you and everyone else knows, they're expensive, they're time consuming, they're embarrassing. They get caught up in the news cycle, and it puts kind of a target on the industry's back, and it kind of makes it look amateur. And I will just say that, yeah, maybe you should have a recall if you mix up your THC and CBD, right? Someone wanting to buy CBD flower now gets intoxicated. That's a higher risk error. But we've seen in the past, like you highlighted, recalls for 1% difference. I like, I believe early in pre-legalization, when it was a medical only regime, we had, I think it was like a decimal point, and I would just say that those should have never been recalls, right? If your vape or your butter or your wax can have a 15% relative on a high end at 80%, like a 10-20% absolute variability, your dried flower should have some wiggle room. And this is what we've discussed previously in our previous webinars with the most recent one. I think the industry, the labs, everyone's calling for some sort of variability. What did you recommend there, Ryan? 10, 20%?
Yeah, I think around 20%. If they wanted to take more of a natural health products approach, they could also aim for just a minimum THC. So I know that sometimes that's on different herbal supplements, as they say, hey, there's a minimum of like 10 milligrams of this active metabolite, or this active compound. So that's something that could be considered, as well as just this variability range, because you already have the variability range for the 2.0 products. You might as well have the variability range for the other, like for the flower, just kind of finish it off.
Yeah, I mean, and the whole like relative versus absolute variability, if you have one relative amount, the higher you go, the more variable you can be on an absolute basis. So maybe something like the edible system, where if it's kind of staggered, if you're 0 to 10%, here's your allowed variability, 10 to 20, 20 and over, you have kind of more tighter conditions. Others have suggested get rid of THC or CBD labeling altogether. I can see some arguments related to that, but I think it's very important for people to understand what they're partaking. And yes, cannabis or cannabinoids are not the whole story when it comes to user experience, but they are important. And there's a difference between 5% THC and 25% THC, right? So that's interesting. The other thing I really liked is, going on the OCS website and using their filters to look at what's out there. While you're doing the presentation, I prompted myself to go on OCS and do this. And so I have some up-to-date numbers. So luckily, the high level is now at 39 instead of 40 something percent. Now, mind you, these are kind of labeled claims. So when a user submits these products to the OCS, they kind of have to bracket them. But there's 360 dried cannabis flower products on OCS right now. 187 of them, or 50%, or a little more than 50%, are above 30%. What's even more interesting is if you use that slider and you say what's over 25%, it's 337 out of 360 products, or 93% of the products on the OCS website for dried flower are listed as having potentially higher than 25%. So I don't know how that matches reality, given what we know about larger data sets, that 18 to 20% is the average, and 25% you're getting into that tail end, potential outliers or very rare, rarefied kind of earth. So yeah, interesting. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I know that OCS is trying to tackle this issue. They have that recent announcement where they're going to be screening and doing third-party testing. So we'll see. And we also know Health Canada is knocking on doors for license holder and labs targeting cannabinoid potency inspections, looking at retained samples. So it's clear the industry has spoken and been vocal enough that the regulators and the provinces have, trying to do something, but I think we're still a ways away from solving this issue.
Which I
Um,
feel like it was almost a non-issue, like if they just set it up initially in the regs in 2018, 2019, like it could have been resolved. It would not have gotten to this runaway selection or this positive feedback of higher and higher and higher levels. Like I was waiting for 50% dried flower. I was really waiting for that day and it never happened. So,
Yeah, hey, there's still time, but I agree. I mean, this is an artificial problem, somewhat caused by, perhaps not the greatest first draft of the cannabis regs, but we know that this was a new thing for everyone, and the regulators, you know, did the best they could, but now changes are a little harder to make. So, well, I think we're moving in the right direction as an industry, but still, uh, you know, it's not moving fast enough. I mean, I personally have been pounding my fist on the table about this for I think 3 or 4 years, quite intensely now, and it's taken that long to kind of get to where we are. Okay. I want to. There's a few questions and comments we have, and then we can maybe talk about the equivalency as well after a few comments. But Ben here
hmm.
says that Cannabis Regs Section 123 2A states that dried cannabis must maintain between 80 and 120% of its THC and CBD content at its expiry date. This isn't commonly used since the majority of LPs do not state an expiry date for dried cannabis. So could we consider this plus minus 20% to be an implied variability limit for dried cannabis? Ryan, I don't know if you wanted to have any.
Yeah, like my recommendation there is that there should be some expiration date mentioned. Cannabis isn't honey. It doesn't last forever. THC degrades into CBN or it's oxidized into CBN. So there's all sorts of things that happen as it ages. So perhaps maybe since this is already in the regulations to have some sort of variability limit, then to implement an expiration date on the package could really improve like customer safety or consumer safety, as well as kind of implement this variability limit that's in place.
Yeah, I mean, the expiry date thing is a little difficult, right? Because in order to state an expiry date, you typically have to do some sort of stability trial, which takes time. You have to do it per cultivar or strain. So every time you release a new product, you'd be waiting 1 or 2 years unless you did some sort of accelerated study. And that's why you don't see many, if anyone. I don't think. I think there's like one instance early on where someone actually had a listed expiry date. But yeah, I think we see enough from the Cannabis 2.0 products regs. We see from here that I know 15 to 20% is probably the right number to go with. But I don't think we can, I don't think Health Canada would say that and take that regulation and say, this is it. I think they want to kind of approach it a little differently. But we're probably going to end up seeing something related to 15 or 20%. We don't know when. Um, Ben also just follow up because I see Alexandra has their hand up. So I'll just say Ben said note regarding the recalls. The majority of recalls are labeling errors, QC issues during production, the wrong potency print on the label. So it's not necessarily that it's retested, and that's true. And Brian did mention that. But still, if it's a labeling error and you're off by 2%, should you be doing a recall? Should you be going through the motions? Technically now, yes, because that's the regulations, but you wouldn't do that on a vape. If you're off by 2%, why would you do that on flower, which, arguably is less accessible to people because you have to roll it up and combust it rather than just, inhaling it. So yeah, something to keep in mind, but definitely, let's not interpret that as having a testing issue altogether. Um, Alexandra, I'm not sure if you had your hand up. If you still want it up, if you want to say something, by all means, please raise your hand. And while we wait for some more questions, here, Andrian, who was at RPC and part of our association and just did a recent talk, also made a good point. You mean Ryan, you compared illicit to licit cannabis prices, which is important because I think a lot of people for these other products, we know price is such a huge factor for their decision, and especially for someone who consumes higher amounts of THC. They just can't justify paying, $5 for five gummies if they can get 10 times as much elsewhere, unfortunately. But yes, illicit cannabis products typically overstate their potency, right? So maybe
Yeah,
divide
there
that
have
by
been
a factor of two or three, but we're still in a different kind of magnitude, order of magnitude, even if you account for that.
yeah,
Uh,
there's huge levels of variability with the illicit stuff. It's whatever they have on the label. It probably doesn't match what's in the product itself. So again, it's always buyer beware. But yeah, even if you take into account two to three times less than what's on the label,
yeah.
you know, yeah,
Yeah, and there are many benefits to legalization, standardization, obviously quality assurance. But at the end of the day, a lot of people vote with their wallets, and if someone is on limited income or whatever, they just can't budget in that, and they want to use those products, they will inevitably go seek them out elsewhere. And I think this is the balance that the government is trying to have here is we don't want a free for all, but we also do want to displace the illicit market. And so how do we strike that balance? We're doing a pretty good job with dried cannabis and other products, and it seems those edibles are this last big stronghold that the illicit market has. Um, Rakesh asked, can I get this presentation in an email? Yeah, reach out
yeah.
to Ryan. Ryan,
First
is
name
it
dot last name at uottawa.ca, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. So
perfect. And we'll have this presentation online shortly on YouTube. Brandon here says others have noted regarding the 1% difference recall. That's about matching the label to the COA. Absolutely. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter when we know that the plant itself is probably 5 or 10% absolute variability, right? I mean, it's the letter of the law versus, reality. But yeah, definitely something to consider. And then some Cornelius here asks, is terpenes quantity becoming more of a reason for recall? So Ryan, I don't know
I
if
didn't see any. It's been strictly kind of THC. There was one with CBD. But aside from that, I haven't seen any with terpene.
yeah.
But I think the comment kind of touches on that too.
Yeah, I mean, terpenes are not required or mandated by the regulations. They're allowed. So, I guess my experience working in the industry on the quality assurance side is if this issue comes up in an inspection, if someone says, "Hey, you're claiming 5% terpenes and there's only 2% in here," number one, they're not again considered by the letter of the law here active ingredients like THC or CBD, so they probably wouldn't be recalled. And then there's also probably a very low risk to that, so that would be probably a corrective and preventative action required by Health Canada, and don't do this again moving forward. But we might see that more often. I mean, there's a lot of people putting a lot of label claims beyond THC and CBD. Their growers, dog's name, and what have you on there. So we might see that, but at this point, we wouldn't expect a recall for that.
And to kind of comment on the terpenes briefly, I feel like no other industry has such a high level of organic chemistry involved with it, where the consumers need to know these confusing names. Like I've heard beta caryophyllene pronounced like 20 different ways so far. So I think maybe taking an approach from the wine or the beer realm of things to kind of talk about what flavor profiles are instead of necessarily focusing on the terpenes, because you can have super duper trace amounts of terpenes that make a huge impact on the flavor or aroma of the cannabis. So that's something to kind of keep in mind.
Absolutely. And we hosted a webinar about terpene analysis and terpenes not too long ago. So check that on our YouTube channel. Okay, Ryan, we've kind of reached our hour here, so we'll just wrap it up. I want to, on behalf of our audience here, our board, our association, thank you for raising your hand to do this talk. It's always very important to discuss this. We appreciate it. Reach out to Ryan, everyone, if you want a copy of that or to connect and learn more about Ryan's research or get some information from him.
If you
Uh,
want to hire me, you could do that too.
exactly. Perfect.
I'm in the job market right now, so
Exactly. So that's great. And please, I'll just remind everyone, consider becoming a member of the C45 Quality Association. And please, if you're located in Ontario or if you have a somewhat of a travel budget, please consider buying a ticket, coming out to the summit. I don't know if Ryan's going to be there. I know I am. A lot of our board will be there. We have Health Canada coming. We have other industry participants, lots of labs. It's going to be a great time to get together, a little bit of a therapy session. We can all hug it out and talk it out and kind of reconnect. It's been a while, but please, we're all looking forward to that. And if you want to know more, c45summit.com or reach us at the team at c45association.com. Okay, thanks everyone. We'll end it there, and we'll see you next time. Take care.